Hey folks, thanks for listening to this episode of the Peaceful Way podcast. I just wanted to remind everyone to give the show a 5-star rating and review if you're using an iOS device. Also, please share the show if you like it. And you can also support the show on Patreon or cryptocurrencies. All those links are in the description. Anyways, I hope you enjoy my discussion with Abeil on the situation, the evolving situation in Ethiopia. Peace. Welcome back to the Peaceful Way podcast. This is Jordan. I'm here with a very special guest, Abeil. And today we are discussing the current conflict in Ethiopia and maybe even just some of the history of the region as well. Abeil, how are you doing, man?
I'm doing perfectly fine.
Good. So why don't you just start off telling people a little bit about yourself and what kind of your background is, and then also what is your interest in the current situation that's going on in Ethiopia?
So I am currently residing in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I am a recent Temple graduate, got my degree in public relations. Since then, I really haven't been doing much aside from applying for jobs. My interest in the situation, I have a huge interest because my home country, Eritrea, is at war. So I'm just following the situation closely, especially because Biden did recently place sanctions, which I kind of roll my eyes at.
Yeah, for sure. I think we'll get into all the U.S. involvement and sort of some of the odd statements coming out of Secretary of State Blinken. I have read a little bit about sort of his recent trip to Kenya, I believe, and he had sort of been commenting on the situation in Ethiopia. A lot of it is very strange and vague, and they're definitely, the Americans seem to be trying to take a very neutral stance there. But anyways, why don't you just let's just start from the more recent events, and then maybe we'll move our way backwards. What's been happening in Ethiopia essentially since November of 2020.
So on November the 4th, a ruling political party called the Tigray People's Liberation Front launched several military offensives against the Ethiopian federal government located in the capital of Tigray called Mekelle. This comes years after rising political tension between the TPLF and the federal government. For anybody that doesn't know, the TPLF was an armed political group that came into power after the Ethiopian Civil War ended in 1991. And they were a very oppressive group. One of the things they did after the Ethiopian Civil War ended was created their own constitution that pretty much states that elections have to be had every 5 years and that they were going to be divided amongst ethnic lines. So pretty much that created a divide and conquer rule that allowed them to rule from 1991 to 2018. During that time, in 1991, Ethiopia did get its independence and became its own independent country. But in 1998, when the Tigray People's Liberation Front were at the helm of Ethiopia, had a border dispute with Eritrea over land that was in dispute within the Tigray region bordering Eritrea. So that dispute wasn't solved until 2018, where the TPLF were removed from power after mass protests from an ethnic group called the Oromo. When the TPLF was removed, we had Abiy Ahmed, who had big dreams of revitalizing and reforming Ethiopia. And one of the major things that Abiy Ahmed did that garnered international attention was form a peace deal with Eritrea. And that was very huge because they were at odds for 2 decades. And that pissed off the TPLF. And things came heated when the 2020 elections was here. And because of the coronavirus pandemic, Abiy Ahmed, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, I should say, canceled the elections. And the Tigray People's Liberation Front gave him the middle finger and went and did their own elections. And they felt the reason why they should do the elections because Abiy Ahmed was never elected, and that this was an abuse of power. And so Abiy Ahmed decides to cancel the results of the elections in the Tigray region, which afterwards Abiy Ahmed decides to cut off fundings to the Tigray region, which the TPLF has said that this was amounted to war. So that's when the November 4 attacks on the federal military base happened, and everything afterwards has just gotten worse.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I think that's a good setup for kind of a lot of what we're going to discuss. Let's get into a little bit more. Well, let's start with the TPLF and who they are. What do you think, in your estimation, their sort of like a political philosophy is? How did they come to power? And just what's your view on the TPLF in general?
The TPLF is a very oppressive and brutal regime. They came into power in 1991 after overthrowing the Derg regime and Mengistu Haile Mariam. So and Mengistu Haile Mariam came into power in 1974, and he was a very oppressive ruler himself. He did something called the Red Terror, which was cracking down on dissidents and people who opposed them. And the TPLF had help from Eritrea because they were fighting for their independence for long before that. I don't really like the TPLF. They're a very oppressive regime, and they were looting Ethiopia's economy for decades. They took about billions and billions of dollars, and what's so ironic is that none of the people of Tigray ever got it. I think a lot of them are on food stamps, and that's pretty sad.
Yeah. What do you think is the actual Tigray region? What is the sort of situation on the ground for the average person there? Are they, because sorry, and just to do a bit of a rabbit trail here, I like a little bit that I have read about the TPLF is they are very entrenched, have been very entrenched within Ethiopian politics, and as a political group, they are, even though they're not the ruling party, they are still very influential and powerful. And obviously, they have a military of their own. But what is the like actual situation of the Tigrayan people on the ground? Is it better or worse off than kind of other areas in Ethiopia?
Well, that's a very difficult thing to really talk about because there's been a lot of misinformation that's been going on in this war. We've been told that there's been a lot of sexual violence, a lot of ethnic-based killings. There's a lot of hunger going around, and it's really hard to tell because they're saying that there's a communications blackout, and it's really hard to verify the information, and that journalists are banned from entering the region. But what I find so interesting is how the hell can CNN report it so matter-of-factly as to what's happening in the Tigray region?
Right. Yeah. It does seem it'd be difficult for anyone to know. And I have been reading that the TPLF have even like blocked NGOs and aid humanitarian organizations from entering the region. So it is hard to sort of ascertain what the actual situation is. Okay. And am I right by saying like the TPLF, sorry, they sort of had their genesis, their birth, so to speak, in like sort of the communist movement that came in the 60s and 70s and 80s and whatnot? Or is that sort of a mischaracterization of them?
I think it's fair to say that they're a communist organization. I think one of the things with the problem with Ethiopia is that it's always been ruled by dictators. I talked about the Mengistu Haile Mariam person. He was a very brutal dictator himself. But then afterwards, when he's overthrown and we have the rise of Prime Minister Meles Zenawi, he was a very brutal dictator himself, and you just couldn't really do much in Ethiopia.
Yeah. Yeah, it is sort of interesting when I actually spent some time in Mozambique like a decade ago. I was there for a few months and just kind of reading up on the history of Mozambique. They also had sort of this communist revolution, and much like communist nations in Asia, it does seem that when communism is imported to these countries, it kind of just dissolves into almost like a nationalist dictatorship, and it doesn't really resemble anything of what we would call communist ideals, right? So it's maybe these movements are just leveraged for sort of power hungry demagogues who want to rule the region, I guess, is a way to look at it.
Oh yeah, definitely. It's kind of a sad situation on all fronts.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so that's a bit about the TPLF, and that's the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. That's the acronym. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So okay, now let's get into another important player in this whole conflict, Abiy Ahmed. Do you want to get a little bit into his sort of biography? And I'll just, before you get into that, everything I've read about him, it's mostly good press, other than this last year with the conflict. He has been getting some criticism that, of human rights abuses and whatnot. However, he does seem to be universally praised for his brokering of a peace deal with Eritrea. But maybe you can elaborate more on that. So just who is he? How did he rise to prominence, and what's your view on his leadership?
A few years back, there were mass protests happening in Ethiopia because the TPLF was a very brutal regime, a very oppressive regime. And they were taken out in 2018 after mass protests from the Oromo people in the Oromo region. And when Abiy Ahmed rose to power, he seemed to have a lot of hope because he did that peace deal with Eritrea. I mean, it was very huge at the time, especially when you look at the history between Eritrea and Ethiopia. The people who were displaced in the border dispute were able to return back to home and vice versa and meet up with their families. And that was very huge with it. I know Abiy Ahmed also was able to mend the relationship with Somalia because Somalia and Ethiopia had been at odds with each other too.
Oh, okay, interesting. I didn't know that bit of it as well. It does seem that Abiy Ahmed is he seems pretty popular within the nation, other than maybe perhaps in Tigray. But otherwise, he seems to be fairly popular. He is like I would say maybe a unifying figure. He's unified a number of different political parties under one party. Do you think that that's a good thing, or do you think that he's maybe more of a secret dictator or anything like that? Would you be concerned about him in that kind of way at all?
It's hard to actually say that he is popular in Ethiopia.
Oh, really?
He did recently win the last election,
Mm-hmm.
but there have been reports of anti-government groups forming because they do not like Abiy Ahmed. And Abiy Ahmed is from the Oromo region, but there's a lot of resentment within the Oromo community, and they don't like Abiy Ahmed.
Yeah, it does seem there's a lot of how do you say, like sectarian resentments within the country. And from what I can gather, Ahmed, he was at least his like stated mission was to try and calm those resentments and try and bring everyone together, which seemed like a good goal. And especially in that region, do you think that there is like that is a noble goal, that like this sort of unification of all these different tribal or I guess more ethnic groups within the country is is something that's actually possible to do? And are you more like cynical about unifying everyone under an Ethiopian banner?
I'm very cynical about that because while I do think unity is the right thing to do because you really want to try and create as much peace as possible, there's been a lot of ethnic division and a lot of ethnic hate for decades. So like the Tigrayans and the Amhara people don't like each other. The Oromo and Amhara people are at odds. You also have the Ogaden region, which is the Somali base, at odds with the Afar region, and it's just a complete mess.
Okay. Like, and just as an aside, do you think like, would it be better if like a nation like Ethiopia were to perhaps split off into a couple different nations or a few nations, or do you think they should stay as Ethiopia?
Um, I think they should probably stay. I'm just gonna be very honest with you. I do not see Tigray becoming independent, and even if it were to, it would be a huge disaster because then it would be sandwiched in between two countries that hate Tigray, which is Eritrea and Ethiopia. And then on top of that, it would be very difficult to get trade into the country.
Right. Yeah, they'd probably be heavily sanctioned by both nations, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what's so I guess you were saying like Eritrea and Tigray, there's some conflict there. Where do you know kind of where that all started and what's the history of that? Like why is there the animosity between those two regions?
It's funny because when the Ethiopian Civil War broke out in 1974, the Tigrayans had help from Eritrea because they were fighting for their independence. And the Tigrayans were able to capture Addis Ababa, which was the Ethiopian capital, and Eritrea was able to gain its independence. But there was a lot of conflict between borderland that bordered between Tigray and Eritrea. And ever since then, there's been just bad blood. It doesn't help that the Eritrean president has been president since Eritrea became independent.
Okay. So that's a lifelong appointment for him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As
Do
well
they,
as the,
sorry.
sorry. As well as the TPLF still being in power in Tigray.
Yeah.
And there's always going to be resentment as long as those two parties are in power.
Okay. So do you think like maybe things would in both those regions, if they kind of hit refresh on their leadership, it might be easier to broker some sort of peace?
Yeah, there needs to be like I think both would probably have to go because I just don't see it. President Isaias Afwerki is a brutal dictator, so is the TPLF, and I just don't ever see peace between Tigray and Eritrea.
Yeah. Okay. And he's a brutal dictator. Like in what way? What are some of the horrible things that he does?
You're forced to do military service by the time you're a teenager.
Okay. How old do you have to be to do that?
I think maybe by 13.
Oh wow, that's young.
But on top of that, you can't speak poorly about him or the country, or else you're going to be banned from entering.
Okay. Yeah. Have you? I'm just curious. So you were born there.
No,
No, you weren't.
in Philadelphia.
Oh, you were born in Phil, but are your parents born there?
Yeah, my parents were born in Eritrea.
Okay. Have you gone back there at all to visit?
Yeah, in 2017.
Yeah. Okay. And does it generally feel like is it generally an open country, or you just can't really say anything bad about the government? As long as you don't do that, you can kind of get by okay.
Yeah, you can't really say anything about the president or the country, or else you're going to get banned. And I know somebody who was banned from entering the country.
Even if they're a citizen of the country?
Yeah, they can't get into the country. And on top of that, too, I think by think tanks, Eritrea has been referred to as the North Korea of Africa.
Is that right, eh?
I don't
That
know.
seems like an exaggeration, but I mean, I don't actually, I don't know that much about the country. So,
I don't know much about North Korea, but I do think there is some truth to Eritrea being ruled by a dictator.
right. Yeah. Do you think that Eritrea, like, I don't know how to put this, like, do you think that they could infinitely complicate the conflict in Ethiopia between the Ethiopians and the Tigrayans, um, by getting involved militarily, or are they already involved militarily in that conflict?
Well, they already are. I'm pretty sure Abiy Ahmed admitted that they were in Tigray, and there's been reports of Eritrean of the Eritrean troops killing Eritrean refugees living in some of the refugee camps in Tigray.
Okay.
And they were also in control of certain cities, I believe mostly Axum and Adigrat and Shire,
Okay. Um,
where they were.
is there maybe is Abiy Ahmed maybe seen as aiding and abetting the Eritreans because he sort of seems to be on their side, and if people view them as sort of a dictatorial country, is there maybe some like affiliation with Abiy Ahmed as supporting dictators in other countries? Would that be a
Oh,
dynamic?
oh, absolutely, because this is the very first war Ethiopia and Eritrea fought together.
Right, right. Yeah. Okay. Do you have uh, um, any idea what, like, how many people have died, what the injuries are like? Is there famine? Like, what's the humanitarian situation?
Oh my God, that's so difficult to answer because I do think there is a lot of propaganda. I mean, the most notable example was when there were reports of a massacre in a city happening called Axum. And the day after the Axum massacre was when they were supposed to have when they were going to have their celebration. So it's like, how do you have a celebration after people were killed in a city?
Oh, okay.
Um, I think another big thing that I can say is I think all sides have committed war crimes, especially if you ever heard of the Makydra massacre?
I haven't. No. Tell us about that.
So the Makydra massacre, which happened on November 9, which is shortly after the war started, forces loyal to Tigray had massacred, attuned to about 600 to maybe 1,000, 1,500 ethnic Amharas, and it was pretty sad.
Oh
And I
man.
think this is just an attempt to really stir things up. And I think what happened afterwards was when the Amhara militias came, there were revenge killings of Tigrayans,
Hmm.
and that was pretty sad. I know we also have the bombings of the Eritrean capital. Um, and truth be told, it's a very sad situation on the ground. But the one thing that I have been worried about is that the U.S. has been subtly trying to push for regime change in Ethiopia, because there was an article and a video about how we might have to put troops down there to settle everything.
Yeah. So this is also an interesting dynamic because, again, the way the U.S. operates, especially in foreign policy, they'll throw their weight behind some person 100%, and then 2 years later they'll change their mind and want regime change. And I think it seems Abiy Ahmed is one example of that. And sort of, I don't know how he's lost favor or why he's lost favor with the Americans, but I was reading that Trump had, when Trump was president, he had pulled a number of troops out of Ethiopia, which who knew that there were U.S. troops in Ethiopia, but I guess there was. But now Biden is considering bringing troops back into the nation. Have you heard about that? Could you comment on that at all?
I've seen. I thought Trump took troops out of Somalia, but I mean, if that probably happened, I guess so. And I think what's pretty concerning, I think the reason why there is a concern from like the West is because there is a war on terror, and Abiy Ahmed did pull troops out of Somalia, and with troops being pulled out of Somalia, there's always a chance for Al Shabaab to potentially take control of areas that were in where the Ethiopian troops were.
Right. Okay. Uh, do you think that like I mean, here's my view on it. Like, I'm just looking at the situation, and it does appear to me that that the Abiy Ahmed is like the legitimate ruler, if you could call it that, of Ethiopia, and Tigray seems to not want to accept that. However, with the sort of delaying of the election, I think that definitely, whether that was legitimate or not, I think it sort of creates an inevitable situation where there's going to be a lot of grievances anytime you delay an election for any reason, really. So, or is it just that Tigray was waiting for a good moment, and that was the sort of expedient political move at the time? They didn't really care one way or another. They just saw that as an opportunity to start resisting the Ethiopian government. What do you feel about that?
Well, I mean, technically, the election did happen and Abiy Ahmed did win re-election, but I think the reason why the Tigray or the TPLF really wanted to have the election, so I think they saw it as an opportunity to potentially get Abiy Ahmed out of power because he was the one that took them out of power and started doing things they didn't like.
Right, right. And do the Tigrayans have like a legitimate concern only in that they are bordered by Eritrea and there's a lot of animosity there? And if the Ethiopian government is a lot more sympathetic to Eritrea, would the Tigrayans do they have legitimate concern over that
I think
dynamic?
I think they do because President Isaias Afwerki is a brutal dictator, and even though the border dispute was settled in 2000 and the UN had to get involved, there was always a bit of a military conflict even in the years afterwards. Most notably, the Battle of Sarona, as well as Isaias Afwerki sending or bombing a city called Abdegrad. And he's committed a lot of heinous crimes to the Tigrayans, and they're not really fond of him, which I
Yeah,
understand why.
yeah, for sure. It's kind of tough because in a lot of ways, all these actors seem to not be the greatest people or the type of people you would want to be, your leaders or your government. Uh, how do you like, let's just put ourselves in the shoes for a second of like a foreign policy person from the West. It's like, how would they address this situation? Because I think, like, if we're honest, we can agree that both sides of this are not exactly the best types of people, and you're sort of expected to at least throw your sort of, I guess, spiritual support over one or the other. What do you think the approach of the West should be?
I think the West should try and push for all sides to stop the fighting because there has been a bit of a humanitarian hindrance, and I think it's very concerning. You don't want anybody to die. And on top of that, the fact that the fighting has spread past the Tigray region into the Afar and Amhara region, and people in those regions were displaced it's pretty sad. So yeah, I think the West should push for peace.
Yeah. Uh, do you think, like, let's say hypothetically, sorry, let's say hypothetically that it really does start, because it seems like a powder keg right now, the situation in Ethiopia. And it seems like, some people are calling it just minor skirmishes. Some people are calling it an all-out civil war, but whatever the case may be, this could really escalate to something very brutal, and there could be a lot of death and suffering. Do you think that like other countries should get militarily, and if it does, if the conflict gets worse, do you think they should get involved in this, or do you think people should just have a hands-off approach and allow whatever happens to happen?
Well, I mean, it's hard because if you have other military, other foreign militaries involved, well, who are they going to be siding with? Because you would have the Ethiopian federal government in this. You would have the the Amhara state military involved and the Tigrayans involved. So like, who are they siding with? And it's also important to note that there is one foreign nation involved, and that's Eritrea.
Right. Yeah, of course. Yeah, I guess I'm just more thinking like world power has got involved. You know, even like China or something. China has made a habit of sort of being opportunistic throughout Africa in like geopolitical situations and embedding themselves inside different countries' governments. I would kind of wonder if a nation like that might take advantage of the situation and offer support to one side or the other. And then once one side comes out on top, then China can sort of embed their economic interests inside the country. So I don't know if you've heard about any Chinese influence, but if that were to happen, you could see then the Americans starting to want to get involved to try and keep China's influence out, right? So there's so many. It seems like there's so many variables and moving parts that could escalate the situation or make it much worse. I don't know if that seems plausible to you or not, but
I think months ago, when Joe Biden signed an executive order to place sanctions on the parties involved, China was directly against Joe Biden for doing so, and I think Russia was too.
Yeah. So, do Russia and China, are they trying to exert any influence in the region at the moment?
It's hard to say because I've really just been looking at it from a U.S. perspective, but I know that the China is probably against whatever the U.S. is doing, and in a way has become a bit of a proxy war.
Right. Well, this is always the concern in all of these conflicts, is that they end up turning into proxy wars, right? And when like major powers get involved with these sort of smaller nations, it can end up turning into a proxy war. But I'm also wondering, like, is there any other interests that, like, in terms of resources or economic interests, that larger nations would have in Ethiopia or even Eritrea, for that matter? Or do you think there really isn't anything in regards to that?
In terms of resources, it's hard to find out. I mean, I know Ethiopia has a lot of spices down there,
Right.
but also Ethiopia is a very important ally when it comes to fighting the war on terror. I mean, if you remember the Ethiopian invasion of Somalia, they were when George Bush had utilized Ethiopia to invade Somalia for their war on terror.
Okay. What's your view on the Ethiopian invasion of Somalia?
Well, I mean, it was to fight the war on terror, and obviously, I mean, the war on terror has been a disaster. It feels like every time when we try to fight terrorism, it just creates more terrorism.
Yeah, for sure. I totally agree with that. There's so many things about the war on terror. It is interesting. Like, how old are you, Abeil?
I'm actually 24 right now.
Okay, yeah, I'm 33. So I'm just old enough to remember when, I don't know if you remember it quite as much, when the war on terror all started, and 9/11 and the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, but the general war on terror and getting militarily involved in so many countries around the world, and the creation of things like the Patriot Act and the TSA, and spying apparatuses to spy on your own citizens. And I'm in Canada, and a lot of people don't realize this, but we totally got involved in all of that. And we've been very instrumental. Our own military industrial complex, which does exist, but is largely ignored in this country. It never really becomes a topic of discussion in the sort of political sphere, which I think is a shame and unfortunate. But yeah, like just going back and like remembering how 9/11 really changed the world, and a lot of everything that's going on in the world right now is almost a direct result of 9/11. And I mean, you even see things like the national security state, let's call it, not just in the U.S. but around the world. Just the opening of the doors to invade citizens' privacies, collect data on them, spy on them without any sort of judicial oversight, and to do it arbitrarily and on a whim with very few checks and balances. This all started with 9/11, but now you're definitely noticing it with the pandemic, how they're leveraging this sort of cultural attitude and malaise about spying on your own citizens and collecting their records, all sorts of things. I sort of see there's like a huge connection between those two things, that now like the healthcare security state, if you want to call it that, is in response to the crisis is a huge dynamic in sort of what's going on. But yeah, it is crazy, how it's just like you can go back to that one event, the two towers falling, and it's changed everything in like from around the world. But especially Africa has actually been like a big involvement in that, right? Like the war on terror has really affected Africa, and particularly like Northern Africa, obviously, but U.S. involvement in obviously Libya, in Tunisia, in Egypt, and after the Arab Spring and things like that. The sort of war on the auspices of the war on terror and the ability, the sort of legal ability for the U.S. government to be involved in these countries. The precedent was set with the war on terror, and then with every country that fell through the Arab Spring, particularly the Northern African countries, the U.S. was literally involved in every single one in one way or another. Sometimes less, like in the case of Tunisia, but sometimes more, like in the case of Libya and Egypt. And so, yeah, it's like you even see that now. That dynamic is still playing out. Is there concerns of like Islamic terrorism in Ethiopia itself, or is that generally not a huge problem?
I think it's a huge problem because if Ethiopia was to fall, and there's a lot of instability in the region, and because Ethiopia borders Somalia, I think there's always going to be a concern for terrorism somehow making its way into Ethiopia, especially if the fighting really gets out of control.
Yeah, what's like the religious makeup of Ethiopia?
I don't have any idea of what their religious makeup, but I think a lot of them might be Orthodox.
Right. Yeah. From what I understand, there is a huge Christian population in Ethiopia, Orthodox Christian population. But yeah, there's always concerns throughout Africa right now, actually, of more Islamist groups rising to power. What about Eritrea? Is it a similar dynamic? Is it mostly Christian, or is there more of a mix of religious beliefs there?
I think I don't know off the top of my head, but I think I would have to say Orthodox.
Okay, yeah, it's similar there. Is the government does the government have an official religion in either of these countries?
I do not. I'm sorry. I'm not very familiar with the religions of these
It's
countries.
okay. No problem. I'm curious about it and how, I kind of wonder sometimes if that has any like sort of influence on the way things play out. Um, yeah. All right. Uh, do you know, do you think that, or have you read anything more about like US involvement in the conflict? Is it more just political posturing, or do they have any actual, even in terms of diplomatic ties, are they making any decisions within the country in terms, or getting involved in any way in terms of the conflict that's going on?
Well, I believe last May, just before the Tigrayans retook their capital, there was visa restrictions on certain Ethiopian and Eritrean officials. I think back in late August, there was sanctions placed on an Eritrean army general, and I think there was another sanction placed on Eritrea.
Hmm. Do you think that's a good idea? Like, I if you want to like calm tensions, and I don't know, I'm sort of conflicted about in terms of like a geopolitical sense. Like, is it a good idea to slap sanctions on these countries, even though they might be terrible people? Should we try and like keep an open dialogue with them and not try and elevate the tensions?
When has sanctions ever worked?
Oh, well, I know they seem to have not a great track record. But what's like the COVID situation in Ethiopia?
I'm not necessarily too sure. I haven't been following the COVID situation.
Okay. Do you think it's like affecting any of the the conflict at all, or do you think it's they kind of don't they aren't really that's not really what they're not even talking about it there? I don't know.
Yeah, it's just more so about the humanitarian crisis that's
Yeah.
happening.
Is there what was that can you just mention again what was that what do you call it, that massacre, that initial massacre last year that happened?
In where that happened with the Amhara people?
Yeah, yeah, you said like
Oh,
500 to 1500 people had died.
yeah, Mike Hydra,
Mike Hydra, how do you spell that?
MAI space
Yeah,
KADRA.
DRA. Mike
Yeah.
Hydra. Okay, yeah. I'm gonna definitely look at that up. Had there been any other sort of massacres or seriously concerning humanitarian crisis that have been occurring? Any other events that you know of?
Hitsats massacre. Hitsats is one of the four refugee camps housing Eritrean refugees, and I believe there's about 100,000 Eritrean refugees in the Tigray region.
Oh, is that right, eh?
Yeah, and I think the UN also said that over 20,000 Eritrean refugees have went missing since the war started.
Oh, are they? Is there a concern that the Tigrayans are making them go missing? It,
I don't know what they could be missing for. I had read up on a report that that when the Eritrean and Tigrayan forces were in gunfire, were in a gun battle, and the Tigrayan forces lost, I think a Tigrayan soldier took it out on an Eritrean refugee and just straight up killed him.
okay, but you don't know of anything if there's like actual massacres going on in retaliation to Eritrea.
The only thing that I know, because the fighting has mainly happened in the Tigray region in Ethiopia. So I know there's a massacre of Eritrean refugees. There's been also massacres happening in the Amhara region, the Chena massacre, Kombolcha or something like that.
Okay.
Chena Wolo.
Oh wow. Okay. Yeah. It is. Do you think it's like very concerning that like our media in the West hasn't covered these massacres at all? That there's almost no awareness that this is going on. Like these are bigger than any like think of like a quote unquote mass shooting or something in the US, and that gets so much airtime. Yet there are these massacres in Ethiopia and Tigray happening that are orders of magnitude larger than any mass shooting that happens in the US, yet it gets absolutely no airtime. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very concerning that it's not getting me enough attention because we talk about Yemen and Syria. Yet there was a Joe Biden envoy several months ago who said that if the fighting spreads beyond Tigray, that the crisis in Ethiopia could look worse than Syria. And right now it's been
Wow,
spreading
really?
beyond Tigray. Yeah, I think what was it, Joe Feltman? Let me look this up. It might
Sure.
the guy's name is Joe Feltman who might have said that.
Are you like, do you think that's he's exaggerating, or do you feel that that's a very real concern?
Yes, because there's massacres happening in the Amhara region, in the Tigray region, and the Afar region, and the fact that there's been anti-government protests happening, as well as fighting in other regions beyond that. It's a wildly concerning thing. And on top of that, too, the Ethiopian population is about 110 million people. So yeah, of course
Wow,
the number
yeah.
is going to be bigger.
There's 110 million
Yeah,
Ethiopians. Wow. I didn't realize
and
how large of a country that is, or how large of a population that is.
yeah, and the catch too with the TPLF ruling Ethiopia is that the Tigray region only represents 6% of the Ethiopian population.
Right. And isn't that a lot of the dynamics too with the resentment against the Tigrayans is, and because it is so sectarian, a lot of people feel like this small ethnic minority is sort of ruling the entire country, and what right do they have to rule it?
Yeah, I mean, just think of it as like if Asians could rule America. I mean, how does somebody that represents the smallest population somehow get into power?
Yeah, yeah, it's true. It's yeah, it's I guess that you know uh, maybe that's just how like civil wars happen, right? Like a small elite group of people end up taking control of a country. But um, so so sorry, what did that U.S. official say about his concerns about uh, the escalation of violence in the country?
Okay, so the guy's name is Joe Feltman, and the article on foreign policy is titled Ethiopia Crisis Could Make Syria Look Like Child Play.
Wow. And what's the concern there? Is it just is it just like bullets, or is there like concerns of chemical weapons? Like worse weapons being, or more deadly methods of warfare being used? Is there like a primary concern?
Well, the primary concern obviously is civilian death, but there's other alleged war crimes. Just last week or 2 weeks ago, there were reports of women in the Amhara region were being gang raped by Tigrayan troops.
Oh man, that's horrible, horrifying.
In hunger too.
Yeah, for sure, hunger and famine. How do you like? How do you think this ends? Like, do you see a plausible resolution to this, or at least a de-escalation of the violence?
I don't know how this is going to end, honestly.
Yeah, fair enough. It's always hard to tell. Yeah, I mean it is very concerning. What do you think is like in terms of death toll? What do you think is like the worst case scenario? Do you think it's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions? Like what could be the worst case scenario if this escalates even further?
I'm not sure of what the death toll is, but I do know that a lot. It's in the tens of thousands when you combine the Amhara, Afar, in the Tigray region. But there's also a lot of people being displaced and running off to Sudan, and we all know how that's Sudan is because they just
Right.
ended several years ago.
Right. Yeah. And Sudan is even still is both north and south, it's still very unstable, and from what I understand, there's still a lot of tension between the north and the south. Yeah, it's. Are there any other countries in the surrounding region that are sort of feeling the effects of this, like that we haven't mentioned yet? Like, I don't know, Kenya. I know Kenya has commented a lot on the conflict, but anything like that, like, are they seeing a lot of refugees, things like that? Uh, are they giving humanitarian aid? Do you know what the situation is with the surrounding countries in regards to this?
I know the Kenyan president did have a meeting with Joe Biden, but I'm not sure what the discussion was about. The only thing I know of is that the refugees have been running into Sudan, and I think there might be some running into Djibouti.
Okay, yeah. Uh, and is there a concern that there will be like a refugee crisis, much like we saw from North Africa to Europe, and sorry, also like from the Arab Peninsula as well to Europe? Do you think that there's a concern that there could be a refugee crisis from Ethiopia, or even more specifically in Tigray?
There has been a refugee crisis.
Okay.
Well, a lot of, yeah, there's been a refugee crisis and people just running away. I do know that there are some Eritrean refugees who went back to Eritrea. Um, there's refugees running into Sudan and I believe Djibouti, but I think some of them might be running into other regions, and specifically Addis Ababa.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. It is like in places like Addis Ababa, is the city itself experiencing any violence, or have they been able to keep it away from the major city centers?
CNN put out a report claiming that the Tigrayan troops were closing in on a capital, but it was a bunch of fake news crap. So I don't see Addis Ababa. I don't see Addis Ababa in danger.
Why did they report that? Like, what were they trying to report on? Like, what were they using as their information for that?
I don't know. CNN is pretty fake, and a lot of Ethiopians have turned against them. So
Oh, is that right? Yeah. Oh, I'm
yeah.
sure a lot of the press is been pretty a lot of malfeasance in their reporting of this. Um, so just and maybe this is a little more inside baseball. Sorry. um, I've noticed a lot on sort of in the Twitter sphere, people who are following this. It does seem to me like there's a lot of support, and again, it's hard for me as like someone completely disconnected from the situation to really gauge, what the politics or the dynamics is. But there does seem to be like a lot of support for uh, the current president, or prime minister. Is it prime minister Abiy Ahmed?
Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed,
Yeah.
the president
Sorry.
is somebody else. The
Oh,
president is some lady named Sally Work Sweetie, but I don't know what her role in this is.
Okay.
I don't think
So
she has
they have
power.
like that. I know there's some countries they have both president and a prime minister. Yeah. Okay. So there does seem to be like a lot of support for the Ethiopian government. It seems every now and again, though, every time Ethiopia launches an offensive against the Tigrayans, you see a bunch of people say, like, calling it a massacre in Tigray and genocide against the Tigrayans. Do you think that that's an accurate characterization, or do you think that's maybe a little bit hyperbole?
I think it's more so the Ethiopian and Amhara government has been launching offensive to keep the Tigrayans out of the Amhara region. I don't really, it's hard for me to call it a genocide, just because I feel like that word kind of stirs a lot of fear into Western officials, because what happens when Western officials don't do anything, they're going to be viewed as the people that stood by when something awful is happening.
Right.
I don't, it's hard to really gauge the situation on the ground, honestly.
Yeah, for sure. I'm right there with you. I think calling things genocide, I think we do we throw that term around very loosely, and there is like a very specific definition of what a genocide is. But I like it to me, if I had to, it's like again, I'm sort of like shooting from the hip here. But if I had to guess it, any of these offensives against the TPLF are are more in self-defense. Like they're trying to push the TPLF back into Tigray, and it, whatever the case may be with that, you know, we can argue about the legitimacy of the government itself, but they are. It does appear to me that they're acting in somewhat of a self-defensive manner, and they're not just like marching into Tigray and massacring people and you know, overthrowing the government. Is that an accurate characterization?
Yeah, I would say so. Because the federal government can be wherever it want. I mean, Abiy Ahmed just technically rules over Tigray too, but by the definition of him being the prime minister of Ethiopia. So really, if there was any invaders, I would say the Amhara invaded the Tigray region, and the Tigray region invaded Amhara.
Right. Do you think that there's any the TPLF, will they accept any sort of terms, or do you think that they're sort of just out for blood and there's no resolution? Like it seems to me, either unless they're allowed to like declare independence or they become the ruling party, is there a situation in which they'll accept terms of peace in the region?
I don't know, because in late June, when the Tigrayans retook all of their regional capital and forced out the federal government, Amhara militias and Eritrean troops. They were given a ceasefire by Abiy Ahmed, but they rejected it and pushed it into the Amhara and the Afar region. So to me, I think it just signals that they really want to be able to get back into power too, especially when aid ended up stopped going into the Tigray region because of that.
Yeah. Would they accept, like, if in a hypothetical world, if Ethiopia offered them independence, would they accept that? Or are they kind of like staunchly, no, we're the rightful rulers of Ethiopia. We don't want independence. We want the whole country.
I think they would probably much rather retake Ethiopia, because the Tigray, I don't think, can survive without a federal government.
Right. Yeah, fair enough. All right. Yeah, that's all super interesting. I think this is like definitely something that people need to pay more attention to what's happening here. And even on my podcast in general, I'm trying to start to cover like conflicts around the world that aren't really covered as much by the media and that people don't really know about, you know. And fair enough, it doesn't really affect you, or you don't see how it affects you. But I think it is important that you know, just putting a highlight on the violence that's happening around the world. But anyways, Bill, I wanted to just, you know, thank you for coming on and talking to me about it. Is there, do you have any like last words? What would you want to tell people about the conflict going on? And is there anything that they could do, or even lend support to sort of the victims of all this?
It's really hard, but I really would love for everybody to just take a look at it, just because I feel like it's not gained enough attention that it should.
Yeah, for sure. And also, is there do you want to plug anything? Do you have any, I don't know, any material or anything? Follow you on Twitter. Is there anything you want to plug before we wrap up here?
You can follow me at you know, I have actually also tried to get Scott Horton to talk about it, but I mean, he said he's behind on a conflict too. So yeah, you could follow me at Link Smash 96. That's my new account, because I got suspended back in August.
What'd you get suspended for?
Because I said monkeys shouldn't be allowed to reproduce to Charlie Kirk.
Oh man. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That So I know Horton hasn't covered it much, but antiwar.com, a lot of the articles I was reading about it, they've been pretty good at like just, and the most of it is just reposting from places like BBC and Al Jazeera, like more international news organizations. But they have been like at least covering it on antiwar.com. But they haven't had any opinion pieces since 2017. So it doesn't seem like anyone from antiwar.com is following them. But maybe, hey, you should maybe submit an opinion piece article or something to antiwar.com and see if they'll publish it.
Okay, yeah, I'll take a look into that, definitely.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, Abeil, I just want to thank you for joining me. This is awesome. And yeah, everyone sort of start reading, paying attention to this conflict, and the people of Ethiopia and the people, I guess just pray God's grace over all the people who are caught in the crossfire, and that the violence can de-escalate. But anyways, thanks for coming on.
All right, thank you. And I'm very glad that somebody asked me about this, because it was like it's not been talked about in the libertarian world. So
yeah, for sure. All right. Peace out.